flows that are pouring through the streets. So I think that's part of the problem. I don't think Zelensky is really in charge of a great deal anymore. He's got a force out there. The nationalists are trying to control what's left of it. They're rounding up deserters and either shooting them or forcing them back into action. But the truth is the Ukrainian forces are defeated. They can't regain what's lost. Most of the Russian army has been withdrawn, Judge. I'm talking about the combat force. They have been resting and refitting for the last few weeks. And the fighting in Donbass, which was always the critical portion of this operation, because that's where the Ukrainian forces were located, has been done by Chechen forces, separatist forces that have taken heavy casualties, and mercenaries. Those are the ones backed by massive Russian artillery, regular army artillery, but the regular army combat force that we saw at the beginning, that's been resting and refitting. And I think they're preparing for a massive offensive to finish off this war once and for all. And again, Putin is not interested in crossing the Dnieper River and going into Western Ukraine. But I think he will roll up to the Dnieper to a certain point, and then I think he still wants to gain control of Kharkov and Odessa.
All right, but as you point out in your piece, Worshipping Dead Horses, Putin cannot tolerate a free and independent Ukraine, much less a Ukraine that's a member of NATO, because that's a permanent 24/7 threat to Moscow. Am I right?
Well,
have I grasped properly what you wrote in this piece?
Well, not completely. I mean, it can be free and independent as far as he's concerned. It cannot be a puppet of the West. It can't be a platform for attack against him.
Or if it's a member of NATO, he views it as a puppet for the West.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, privately, he's told many people he doesn't care if Ukraine's part of the European Union, could care less. His concern from the very beginning was this massive NATO-trained and equipped army funded largely by us. That's no longer in the picture. But what I'm concerned about, what many Europeans privately are concerned about, I know Berlin is very much so. And remember, Berlin is still the elephant in the room economically. And right next to Berlin is a somewhat smaller elephant called Italy. Both of these states are concerned that what will happen is that we will go back into Ukraine in a subversive way and try to continue to use the Ukrainian people and the rump Ukrainian state as an opportunity to attack and threaten Russia. That's what he doesn't want. And that's what Berlin and Rome don't want. No European wants that. That means literally in our lifetimes, perpetual war, to the point where finally Putin decides, I don't want to go there. I don't want a border with NATO. Remember, that's one of the things he doesn't want. He doesn't want a border with NATO. He's already got a small one way up north in Estonia. He doesn't want it. So if he can't live with the situation because we make it impossible, well, then, you're forcing his hand again. I think it's time for this to end, and I think the Russians are going to try to do that over the next 30 days.
What are U.S. intelligence, senior members of the intelligence community advising the president? If you know, are they telling him what they think he wants to hear? Or are they telling him what you've just described, that this is a lost cause, it's over with, you better get the hell out and get out now?
Judge, the thing for all of your viewers to keep in mind is that presidents always get the intelligence they want.
Even if it's not truthful.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Because we've lost our sense of proportionality. If you think that you are invulnerable, invincible, and more powerful than everyone else, then you think you can afford to ignore things like the truth when it suits you. This has gotten us into a lot of trouble now, I think, with Russia, because Russia is not Iraq. Russia is not Afghanistan. It's not Libya. And, we're talking now, I listened to the former Secretary of State Pompeo essentially describe the apocalypse, the unification of Russia, China, and Tehran into one iron alliance that we should then set out to crush. I mean, this is the sort of madness that is rampant in Washington, and it presupposes that we are more than we are. In other words, we are not the nation, Judge, as you know, that we were in 1991. Right. 30 years ago, we were a very different country than the country today. And there doesn't seem to be any willingness to admit that and figure out that we've got serious problems here that need our attention.
One
By the
of
way,
the
that's true for Western Europe.
one of the problems that you point out in your piece, Worshipping Dead Horses, you sort of pivot from explaining the uselessness and weakness of NATO into serious problems with the American military, which have been visited upon it by the attitude of current leadership, the Biden administration, with respect to promoting people on the basis of race and gender who are not the most qualified, and establishing the sort of woke atmosphere in the military that people like you and I and people watching us today laugh at when we see happening on college campuses. Now you're telling me and telling your readers that this is happening in the U.S. military. Have they considered the long-term effect of this nonsense?
Yes, unfortunately, I think they have, and I don't think they understand just how debilitating it is. On the one hand, you have a president who is more warlike, frankly, more aggressive, more bellicose than any president I can remember in my lifetime when he talks about Russia. Not China, but Russia.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
George W. was bellicose, but not with respect to Russia.
Never. Absolutely not. And the key thing here is that while we have all this bellicosity on one side, we're systematically devastating the armed forces on the other side.
To tell us how the armed forces are being systematically devastated?
Well,
imagine American armed forces.
Imagine you have a group of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Doesn't matter, but I would think certainly soldiers and Marines. And you announce that the commander has been removed, and you have a new commander. Your new commander is Tiny Tim, with the ukulele in the flowered shirt and the long hair.
Right, this is crazy.
He has kind of a uniform on, but
this is crazy, Colonel.
Yeah, but that's essentially what you've got. And says, look, Tiny Tim is one of the finest people we've ever met. And by the way, he's transgender, but you've got to take showers with him because he deserves the opportunity to take showers with you, even though he's transgender. And he may not wear a skirt all the time, but he's wearing one today. You have to tolerate all of this. This is important, and this is what makes us free. This is what we're talking about with diversity. And then the other thing is, I'm sorry, you're not a woman, you're not black, you're something else. You may be white, you may be Asian, Northeast Asian. We're not interested in you. We don't care how well you have performed. We don't care how many years you've served. We don't care about your performance under fire in combat. We're interested in Sheila over here and moving her forward because we want a new force that is radically different from the one you're in.
All right. When the government, and I realize there's some metaphors and exaggerations in there, but it's largely a summary of what's been happening. When the government does that, does it think in the long term, we don't use a draft anymore. We really need volunteers. We need thousands of volunteers every year. And our base for volunteers are young, virile men who really don't care about woke and don't want wokeness imposed on them, whether the young men are white or black or Hispanic or brown or whatever they may be. My point is, does the Biden administration leadership in the Pentagon recognize that imposing wokeness on the military will have a catastrophic effect on recruiting in the long term?
I think they've already seen it. We're already confronting this catastrophic impact on recruiting. We can't recruit the people that we want. And their attitude is it doesn't make any difference. We'll just drop the standards. We'll start recruiting people that we normally never take into the armed forces, people that are far below the desired IQ levels, people that have criminal records, people that may have serious problems, drug problems or something else. This is already happening. So again, I think they view it as none of these things matter anymore. We live in the era of push-button warfare. Fire a missile. We're still the biggest, most powerful, richest country in the world. We can do pretty much as we want. And the important thing in the backs of their minds is that we're building a force that reflects our leftist ideology and values. And we're replacing the values that were historically motivating inside the armed forces with our new values.
One of my viewers just text us, who wants to die for Biden and Zelensky. It's just so appealing. I mean, no American wants to do that. Does Tony Blinken? Does Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, do they think American troops want to die either for wokeness or for Zelensky?
Lloyd Austin is a mystery to me. I've never met the man, and looking back on the years that he served, he certainly was an enormously. Let's put it this way: he benefited enormously from the system that we have in place, right. Affirmative action and other things, and yet he's turned on the institution and seems to be turning on the American people and the country with incredible hatred and distaste. It's hard for me to fathom and imagine. It's even more difficult for me to look at senior officers who stand around and act as though this is perfectly normal. And when you say, "What the hell are you doing?" their answer is, "Well, I've got orders." Wow. Orders to do what? Destroy the force?
Right.
Ruin morale, destroy cohesion, destroy discipline. We don't even have the authority today in the chain of command that we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago to take action when it's required.
What is the level of wokeness? It's hard for me to ask this with a straight face in the Russian army.
Yeah, that's a great question. The last time I looked at a recruiting video, I'd say about 0. Everybody there understands the Russian army exists to kill enemies of the Russian state. And all the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines understand that's their number one task. We go to where we're ordered and we defend the country and we kill the enemies of the state.
All right. We're now at the end of July. Where will we be by Labor Day in the war in Ukraine?
I'd be
still sending billions of dollars in cash and material there, or recognizing the folly of what we've done?
I'm glad you brought that up, because most Americans don't understand, Judge. If you look at this $40 billion package that we passed back in May, almost universally, right, only about half of that is for military assistance. It's still $20 billion, but it's enormous.
What's the other half?
Well, the other half it's unclear. It goes into aid and assistance that we would term nation building, support the Ukrainian state, humanitarian assistance, medical support, and so forth for the war. But most of the money for military equipment and military assistance really doesn't leave the United States. And this is what most people don't understand. When we say we're going to give the Ukrainians, for discussion purposes, let's just say 100 artillery pieces, we turn to the Department of Defense and say, send 100 artillery pieces to Ukraine. And they say, yes, sir. Then we send money over to the Pentagon to pay for the 100 artillery systems that we've taken and shipped. They then take that amount of money, whatever it is, for those artillery systems, and they turn and give it to the defense industries and say, give us replacements.
Right.
So it's kind of a circular system, because at the same time, remember, when all this money moves from Capitol Hill to DOD to the military industrial complex that we know as the defense industries, that money also involves donations for people on the Hill. That money involves making constituents happy, providing them with employment and jobs and so forth.
Which might explain why the Congress voted actually to give more money than Uncle Joe asked them for, because they're all looking for their next contribution. The late, great Justice Scalia used to say, it doesn't matter why members of Congress say they voted for anything. They only vote for anything for one reason, and one reason only: to get reelected.
Yeah, and that involves a lot of money.
The equipment that's on its way there, or that's there, this is not brand new, just built in North Carolina stuff, is it? Is this stuff that's been surplus, sitting in Warsaw or in a warehouse somewhere outside of Warsaw?
It's a mix. You know, some old things have been sent, but a lot of this is relatively new equipment. And remember, we're also depleting our ammunition stocks. So you've got to replace those ammunition stocks. When you talk about missiles, we've been saying the Russians are going to run out of missiles. Miracle of miracles, they've never run out. But that's because, for instance, if you shoot at an incoming ballistic missile, you have a Patriot missile battery, you're shooting 2 missiles for every one that is shot at you.
Right.
Well, that implies an enormous surplus of missiles on hand in peacetime. Launchers were altered, I guess. One was supposed to be used for a speaker on some sort of stereo system. I don't know what the other one was for, but they were given as gifts by a Ukrainian chief of police to the Polish chief of police with the hope of cultivating closer ties and cooperation. Somewhere along the line, the Ukrainians seem to think it happened after they sent it off to him, and that may well be true. I have no idea. A live grenade was found in this thing, and it accidentally or purposely exploded. We don't know, but it's a very hard to imagine how something like this could have crossed the border from Ukraine into Poland without being detected. I'm sure the Polish chief of police wasn't hiding anything.
How would this have been delivered? Not through the mail.
Well, I don't know. The sad part here is that you're well aware, as many of us are, that there's this long history of antagonism between the Poles and the Ukrainians. So this opens up that whole ugly chapter for discussion. Was this intentional, or was this in fact an accident? Nobody is able to answer it, except that right now, the facts are what I sent you on email, and that's all we know.
What were the injuries to the Polish commander? Do we know?
Apparently none. He had maybe modest scratches or something, but no serious injuries of any kind were reported.
Okay. Do we still have a president of Poland beating the drum and acting as if his troops are going to get engaged? I think we do. Do we not?
Yes. Well, in the op-ed that I just finished that the American Conservative will have out tomorrow, I lead with the remarks of the Deputy Polish Minister of Defense, who is warning an audience on the 29th of November that this war is growing in intensity and Poland is likely to be involved in it, and hints at potential mobilization and a number of other things down the line. Now, since then, we've also had a source tell us that the Polish government is now looking at 200,000 troops that could be mobilized next year. All of this is disconcerting because, remember, inside the NATO alliance, Poland is really alone in its enthusiasm for aggressive war against Russia. Nobody else, with the possible exception of the Romanians, is interested.
Well, your piece is a scary one, Colonel. I mean, you start by summarizing the interview. We talked about this before, but we'll touch on it again. That General Zelensky had with The Economist magazine, and when he asks for 300 new tanks and 600 to 700 new infantry fighting vehicles and 500 new howitzers, you conclude he's not asking for assistance. He's asking for a new army, and he must know that this is not possible.
Well, one would think so, and I think they were trying to set the stage for a meeting with the United States in which they would get more other types of assistance, potentially convince us and maybe others in this so-called coalition of the willing to intervene and help them in some way. That's why I find it extremely disturbing, because President Biden has said from the beginning that we were not going to directly engage the Russians in a military confrontation. Yet we seem to be moving closer to that outcome. And the Poles, of course, I think would actually welcome that, which is very dangerous. This is the problem when you ally yourself with a relatively small state. The small state has a permanent interest in leveraging your power for their benefit.
Right. You point out that Ukraine hospitals and morgues are filled to capacity, and Ukraine with wounded and dying Ukrainian soldiers. How many healthy soldiers do they have remaining? Do you know?
The last word that I had was they had 194,000 quote unquote effectives. And in the article, Zelensky mentions that he's got 200,000 combat ready troops, people that can fight. He has another 500,000 people in uniform, but they're not necessarily soldiers. They may be police, paramilitary, other kinds of functionaries, but they're not fit for frontline duty. And I think that's a huge admission, because it also tells you something about the enormous number of casualties that the Ukrainians have been taking.
Why is General Zelensky saying all this in public? Is there some purpose or goal to this?
Yeah, I think, again, he and President Zelensky know what I know and know what anybody knows who looks carefully at the assembling Russian force and its enormous firepower, standoff attack and direct firepower. And he's being honest. He's saying, well, their attacks could be stronger than we think, and we could be weaker than we thought, later on in the article. In other words, it's a backhanded way of saying, look, this is very dangerous. We probably are not going to succeed against this kind of force. We've asked you for more. What are you going to do? In other words, the ball is in your court, Washington. And after all, we urged them to fight from the beginning. We've never come back and said, well, there's a point at which it makes no sense to fight on.
Would it be fair to characterize General Zelensky as the realist, and President Zelensky as sort of has pipe dreams? And would it be fair to say that the Russians have far more respect for the general than they do for the president?
Well, first of all, I have no idea, but I suspect that Zelensky, who's been on the phone before with his counterpart in Moscow, has at least a rapport with the Russians. What that is and how well that goes, I can't evaluate, but they have talked. And I think Zelensky is being realistic and as open as he can. And Zelensky is permanently cheerleader for the war in perpetuity and has sold himself as Washington's man on the ground to lead the charge against Moscow. I don't think he can back down from that. He's made so many sweeping statements that are so ridiculous that he can't retreat.
Is it conceivable that General Zelensky would work out some peace agreement with the Russians in order to save hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives, no matter what President Zelensky thinks about, almost sort of pushing him out of the way? He's got the pipeline to Moscow. Nobody in Moscow will say a word to President Zelensky.
Judge, we're now in the realm that I would comfortably call the Twilight Zone.
All right.
Who knows? I mean, we could sit here and speculate about that, but I think there are lots of people that are willing to pull out their weapons and shoot people down right now inside Kiev in the government who might go that route. I think that they're stuck. They're going to fight. And perhaps in the midst of this fighting, there will be a call for some sort of ceasefire. And again, the problem is you're dealing now with a Russian government that has given up on the West.
Let's move from the East all the way to the West. Does General Zelensky have respect at the Pentagon? Does he have the ear of General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or of Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, or of Secretary Blinken or Secretary Austin, somebody who can get to the president on the phone in a few minutes?
I'm sure that he probably has a line to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and potentially the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. And remember, we've been down this road before with Milley. He leaked his rejected advice to the president to the New York Times when he said Ukrainians have done about as much as they can and they should negotiate. And that was rejected. And he was sent back out to recant and effectively sing the tune of inevitable Ukrainian victory. So at this point in time, even if he has a direct line, the man in charge is sitting in the White House. And I'm sure that no one in this administration at this stage wants to admit that they made a terrible mistake and put Ukraine's very existence at risk.
Your greatest fear, and stop me if I don't have this right, is that the man in the White House will pull an LBJ. And when his generals, when Westmoreland said to LBJ, we're going to lose unless we don't have another 125,000 troops, LBJ said, you got them. I don't know that Zelensky would say that to Biden, but what's to prevent Biden from saying, I'm using your language, Colonel, you wrote this, it's brilliant. By the way, for those listening to us, it's called Downfall in Kyiv and Washington, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and it'll be available tomorrow at the American Conservative at their website. Colonel, your fear is that Joe Biden wants to lead a coalition of the willing, which is to be about 2 or 3 NATO countries.
Yes, I think that the people in Washington, and when I say people, I'm talking about virtually everybody inside the Beltway, has all drunk heavily from the Kool-Aid that says Russia is weak, Russia is incompetent, the soldiers are no good, the army is weak, we can prevail. We have to stay the course with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians can still outfight them. And if we need to go in to bolster the Ukrainians and try to establish, under the guise of a no-fly zone on the ground, some sort of secure area in western Ukraine, down near the Polish border, in order to provide a safe haven for retreating Ukrainian forces or refugees or something else, we should do that because we can still dominate the Russians if we need to. And that was, see, LBJ knew that he had enormous leverage with the United States Navy and Air Force, not just our ground forces over North Vietnam. We have no such leverage over the Russians. This is a pure continental land combat, and they hold all the trump cards. And we have very few forces, and we're depending very heavily, if we go in there, on the Poles. And while the Poles are very brave, courageous soldiers, that's an irrational act on the part of an American.
I mean, what coalition would there be? Who besides Poland and Romania would be in Joe Biden's army, and America, of course?
Well, I'm sure you'd have some British Special Operations Forces. Beyond that, who knows? I mean, the rest of NATO really doesn't have much to send. I mean, the force that was described in the interview that Zelensky asked for is larger than any of the armies in Europe. So what are they going to send? And the answer is, I don't think they have much to send at all. And now they've already exhausted most of their supplies of ammunition and weapons. They've sent most of that excess that's either now in Russian hands, and some of it is still with the Ukrainians. But the Russians have captured a lot of equipment, destroyed a lot of equipment.
One of our regular guests is an American named Matthew Van Dyke. Matt is the head of Sons of Liberty International, which he describes as all ex-military. These guys are young. They're all like in their late 20s, early 30s, who believe in the Ukrainian cause, who wear military fatigues, who are physically present on the ground. I don't know if they carry weapons. They don't shoot. They're not close to where people are shooting or being shot at. They're training Ukrainians. Matt sent out a rather startling tweet just a few minutes ago. Here it is. Ukraine must conduct a major offensive now. Ukraine has the advantage this winter in morale and logistics. Russia will recover by spring and will never be this weak again. The next 2 months are critical in this war. Don't dig in, advance. Now, I don't know if you know this fellow. He's a young man. He's on with us regularly. This is the first time I've heard him say anything like this. Russia will recover by spring. What do you think about this?
It sounds to me like some of the ideas that were hatched by Adolf Hitler in the spring of 1944 for offensives in the East, when there was no capability whatsoever for offensive action in the German army. Sounds to me like his thinking behind the Battle of the Bulge, when the German army couldn't fuel itself 100 kilometers without falling apart. So I think, I'm sure the man is very sincere and believes in what he's saying, but I think he's dead wrong. And there's not a whole lot for the Russians to do between now and the end of January for them to be ready. I think they're very close to it.
I want to go back to General Zelensky before I ask you about President Putin in Belarus. I want to make sure I understand the numbers. General Zelensky has about 190,000 troops, and then he has 200,000 trained troops and reserves. So if he wants, he has about 400,000 troops. Do I have those numbers right?
Well, he actually gave, and again, I don't know that these numbers are trustworthy. Much of what comes out of Kyiv has never been trustworthy. So take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, but it's Zelensky who has a reputation for being truthful, no?
No. None of the Ukrainians have been truthful about the conduct of this war. They've lied
Okay.
prolifically about everything. And he's saying they have 700,000, 200,000 in that category of fit to fight, trained combat troops, and then 500,000 of others, police, paramilitary,
Okay.
and so forth. Now, again, I have no idea what's going on. I do know that the Nazi enforcers are brutalizing people, forcing them into uniform, sending them to the front.
These are Ukrainian, these are Ukrainian Nazi enforcers forcing young men, able-bodied or not, into Ukrainian military uniforms.
Yeah, they're sending press gangs through Kiev and other cities at nightclubs, night spots, to see if they can find young men who may be there, and then pressing them into service. Sort of what the Royal Navy did in the 19th century and the 18th century to keep the ships filled. So that's why I say I'm sure that Matt's sincere. And I do know that if you ask Ukrainian soldiers, they do speak very confidently of their future as though they have a chance to really win. And you heard that from German soldiers right up until March of 1945.
Oof.
So I don't think that we should take that very seriously.
I would imagine that President Zelensky's people are regressively controlling the media and what the Ukrainian troops and what their families back home hear.
Well, I'm sure they are too, but he doesn't have to work too hard to control the Western media. That's already in his camp.
Already his. Yeah, the CIA has done that for him. Yeah. All right, back to numbers available. What does President Putin have available? Is it 300,000 that are about to add to the fighting force that's there now?
No, the numbers once again that were given were misleading. He said, well, he has 200,000 fresh combat troops, probably more than that. You know, I said a few weeks ago that the numbers by January could go up to 700,000.
Russian numbers.
Russian numbers. And you just divide that roughly in half because about half of that falls into logistics and standoff attack and fire support. The rest of it are attacking forces that go in on the ground to kill the enemy. So I think the Russians are, quite frankly, already outnumber their opponents dramatically. And they have been training very, very hard. Now, you have to add to that number probably 75,000 Belarusian troops. And Putin, of course, is up in Belarus right now.
Right. Now, what is he doing in Belarus? Belarus is another country, former Soviet satellite, but now a separate independent country.
Yes, but they are fully allied with Russia.
Okay.
And Belarus is going to provide whatever is required or necessary for the Russian forces in their country to launch attacks against Ukraine. As I said, there's 75,000 in that army, and most of that is deployed along the border with Lithuania and Poland. But they have a secure base of support in Belarus for at least 150,000 troops attacking north to south.
I'll tell you what I'm afraid of the most as I listen to you and our friend Scott Ritter, and as I read the media available to me, is that the president of Poland is crazy. And he's very, very anxious to begin a conflagration that historians will one day call World War III.
Well, that's again going back to the discussion earlier about a small state ultimately leveraging a large one.
Right. Will Joe Biden, who could get into Biden's head? Will pressure be put on Joe Biden, whether it's from the Pentagon or the globalists, to back Poland up?
Oh, I think that that's very much in people's minds right now, that Poland is the springboard against Russia, and that we should be prepared to use that in order to rescue Ukraine from inevitable destruction. That's why I wrote the article, because I'm afraid that we'll suddenly hear from Joe Biden on the television. Tonight, my fellow Americans, I've directed our forces to advance into Western Ukraine to provide a safe haven or something, a secure zone in Western Ukraine. And it's about peace, democracy, and freedom, all of which has got nothing to do with what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And that's what we said about Vietnam. Only this time, you're not talking about Vietnam, you're talking about Russia, a great power.
If he does that, the Congress will do nothing. The Congress will do nothing. The president of the United States can't start a war on his own. I'm familiar with the War Powers Resolution. I think it's unconstitutional, but it is the law. But this will fall right into the hands of the globalists. And we know their goal: to remove President Putin from power, whether by embarrassment and humiliation or death.
Well, that's why I think it's so important that people understand the meaning of what I've said in that op-ed, that whatever is said to justify potential intervention by us in the western part of Ukraine should be dismissed out of hand as dangerous nonsense. The opportunity to do things differently ended a long time ago. If people were serious about trying to prevent the Russians from moving into Ukraine or deterring them from going any further than a few kilometers, we had that back in February, March, and April. We could have sent vast forces over there very, very quickly. Well, of course we didn't. And Judge, we didn't do it because they're not ready. And we don't have ready forces now for a stand-up war in Eastern Europe. So this is all dangerous nonsense.
Where is General Milley on this? I mean, what General Milley leaked was a truthful analysis of the situation. Then they made him do the mea culpa. So when that happens, I mean, the White House and Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, they must know that Milley is a realist. They can get him to mouth their words, but when they ask for his advice, I assume he's telling them what he.
I think it's very clear that our ammunition stocks, as well as key items of equipment, such as your self-propelled 155 millimeter gun, are in very short supply now as a result of having to supply the Ukrainians. You ask, is it dangerously low? It's only dangerous if we are contemplating a confrontation with the Russians. That is out of the question in my view. And for that matter, if we were to go back to the Middle East and take on any number of opponents there, it would be equally ill-advised. So I would say it's not dangerous unless we are stupid and decide to intervene somewhere.
Have we supplied the Ukrainian military from our surplus or from our substance?
Both. But we have had to rely increasingly on the substantive American military capabilities. There's now talk about sending even more sophisticated missiles with greater ranges, which I find disturbing, because the more we do this, the more likely we are to end up in a confrontation with the Russians, for which we're completely unprepared. But there's talk about that right now in the media.
The last time we spoke, which was a day or two before Thanksgiving, we talked about whether or not there was any impetus on the part of the State Department or NATO diplomats to push President Zelensky and President Putin, to the extent they can push Putin anywhere, toward the negotiating table. In the interim, you sent me some videos, which are too horrific for us to show, which show Ukraine atrocities against captured Russian soldiers. So these are captured Russian soldiers who ought to have been protected by the Geneva Conventions. Obviously, they weren't. They were executed with bullets in the head. Why would this have happened? Why would there have been videos of it? Why would the videos of it have been displayed on Ukraine streaming sites?
Well, Judge, you're right. The videos that show Russian prisoners of war being essentially murdered after they've surrendered have been posted by Ukrainian soldiers. These are videos taken by Ukrainian soldiers and then posted on the internet, essentially as a point of pride, in the belief that they are somehow another frightening or horrifying the Russians, who knows. But I also think there's another sinister dimension to this. I think there's an interest in Ukraine, particularly in Kiev, to ensure that there can be no negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia. Not so much because of people in Kiev that might be willing to talk, but I think there's growing fear that Washington will ultimately abandon them. They know that Ukraine fatigue is not exclusive to Europe. Ukraine fatigue is certainly having impact inside the United States. They can read the news. They know that the new Republican Congress may well turn out to be much less willing to support them than the previous one. So under the circumstances, I think they want to make it almost impossible. And one way you do that is by murdering your opponent's soldiers and then posting videos about it, because it so poisons the waters, if you will, with Russia. And it makes it so difficult for the Russians, particularly President Putin, to come to any arrangement, because the Russian people are seeing these things and are incensed. You have Russian military commanders, and frankly, you know, from the beginning, we've accused the Russians of terrible things. They did not do those things. They did not mass rape. They did not mass murder. That's all nonsense. It's all propaganda that the Ukrainians cooked up and then was disseminated across the West and eagerly regurgitated by the Western media, but it was never
Well,
true.
I'm assuming that what you sent me was real. It certainly looked real.
It's absolutely real. There was another video in the mix, though, that was kind of entertaining because it showed what appeared to be an attempt by the Ukrainians to orchestrate a fake Russian attack on civilians. I mean, and unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess for us, they showed the director of the operation, lights, cameras, and supporting people.
It was
And this is being done before by the Ukrainians as well.
All right. Would the mass display of Ukraine war crimes and atrocities on captured defenseless Russian soldiers, boys, have been approved by the high command, or is this some rogue endeavor by the more hardcore of the Ukraine troops? Do you have an answer to that or an idea on that?
If this was a one-off, and then suddenly the Ukrainian government directed that these videos be removed, and then made a statement that they're going to look into this to establish the facts, and if this is in fact true, they will take action. If that had happened, then one would conclude that these were rogue elements, but that has not happened. And so the only conclusion I can reach is that people in Kiev are saying, look, this will keep the war going. This will make it harder for the United States to abandon us because the Russians won't do business. And that's what they currently think is in their interest.
I want to put on the screen a map of Ukraine, which you have seen. In fact, you were gracious enough to send it to us. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to let our viewers take a moment or so to look at it. The red starbursts represent areas where there's been the concentration of Russian missiles and artillery. The blue represent areas of blackouts where there's no electricity or water to speak of. In the sort of lower right of this portion of Ukraine, the striped area represents the area that has been under Russia's control for a while. So let me start going all the way west. Are you surprised that the Russians sent their missiles all the way west? Well, what is the next country over there west? Forgive my ignorance.
Well, west from the map that you're looking at right now, where you see Lvov, just west of that 20 miles is the Polish border.
Wow. Is it reckless for the Russians to send their missiles so close to the Polish border? Is that a lesson to NATO?
No, it's not reckless at all. First of all, to understand what's happening now, this is very similar to what the United States did in Iraq, to what it did to the Serbs during the Balkan campaigns, the Kosovo Air campaign, very similar to what we did during World War II to Germany and Japan. We systematically identified the networks, the infrastructure for fuel storage, fuel distribution, and today power plants on a grand scale. We did that. We destroyed those places and essentially put countries in the dark and did exactly what you're describing. Made it impossible for them to effectively lead normal lives. That was part of the plan. It worked very effectively in Germany. I mean, we were so effective against the fuel refining, storage, and distribution that it brought the Air Force and the Army almost to a standstill in Germany in 1945, certainly by the end of 44. So that's what we're doing now. And this is long overdue. And this is part of the larger plan to prepare Ukraine for the coming offensives. I mean, why would you let your opponent lead a comfortable, leisurely existence if you plan to attack him on a grand scale on the ground?
Right.
And see, before, with this first phase, no one ever completely grasped what Moscow wanted. They wanted an arrangement. They wanted a negotiated settlement. They were not interested in destroying the country. They didn't want to kill large numbers of people. By the middle of the summer, it was clear that's not going to work. So they threw those assumptions out. They went on to essentially a strategic defense, an economy of force mission. Let's use as few forces as possible to hold on to what's ours, and then we'll build up for the offensive. And that's what's been going on. Now it's getting cold finally. So perhaps in 3, 4, 5 weeks or something, we'll see a major offensive.
Gary, can you put the map up again? Colonel, I want to ask you about the sort of lower right-hand portion, if you will,
right,
where you see the gray and black stripes. Now, as I understand the symbols on the map, that reflects the portions of Ukraine which are in which Russian-speaking people live and which the
yes,
Russian government controls.
yes.
If I'm correct, don't I also see some red symbols there showing Putin attacking that area with either missiles or artillery? How unusual is that? There are Russians living there.
Well, let's not say Putin attacking. You know, he's in Moscow, and
Okay.
these strikes are ordered by the high command of the Russian theater and General Surovikin.
Okay,
Strike
so the generals in chief are attacking
Yeah.
where Russians live. Am I right?
Well, first of all, understand something. Today we have this capability we call strike. Strike is different from what we imagine the standard use for artillery or rockets or missiles might be in the West. The only thing that separates one strike from another is time and space. And we have precision, which means that we could literally, if we saw something in your backyard where you live, Judge, and we thought it was threatening to us, we could target it and destroy everything in your backyard without necessarily harming you. Now, we demonstrated that capability during the Kosovo air campaign. Some of your viewers will remember that the Albanians in particular were shocked at our ability to attack Serb forces that stood next to or were positioned very close to Albanian homes, but they never damaged any Albanian homes. Well, the Russians can do the same thing. And so there was a decision to attack there, ostensibly because there was some connectivity to this power generation network, and they decided to remove it. Now, beyond that, I don't know the details, but it's eminently capable. They're eminently capable of doing this with great precision. That's why striking those targets that were near the border with Poland was not reckless, because they know they can hit them with absolute precision.
Okay, Gary, put the map up again, please. So, Colonel, if the Russians can move with that much precision, then their strikes around Lviv and Kyiv, which we know destroyed residential areas, were done intentionally, that the destruction of homes and apartment buildings was not a byproduct, it was the goal. Is that fair to say?
No, again, that's not accurate, because the power stations and the power distribution networks were inside those areas. In other words,
Where
they
is
didn't decide we just want to level Kyiv. I mean, if they wanted to level Kyiv, they could do it tomorrow morning. It would take a couple of hours. So
where on the map is the nuclear power plant or nuclear power plants?
Well, the nuclear power plant of greatest interest, of course, is the one to the south in the vicinity of Zaporozhye, which the Russians are protecting. The Ukrainians have repeatedly tried to launch missiles and rockets and artillery rounds against that power station in the hopes of precipitating a nuclear crisis that they think they would benefit from.
All right,
The
right
Russians-
above Zaporozhye, it shows the symbol for an explosion. Then to
Yes.
the left of Zaporozhye is the blue symbol for a blackout, and to the right of Zaporozhye is the blue symbol for the blackout. So you're telling us that they want to isolate without destroying and prevent the use of the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye.
Yeah, well, it's not a question so much of preventing Ukrainians from using it. They are protecting that plant from Ukrainian attacks. Now, what they have done is that they have removed the connectivity, as you point out, involving the transmission of power from these plants to Ukraine. That has been done, and that will continue to be done. And we ought to pause for a minute and understand the cascading effects of these attacks. This
Right.
affects everything, every part of life in Ukraine. You're not just talking about transportation and water, of course. You're also talking about rural life where you have herds of cattle, herds of sheep, vast farmlands. Now those animals and the farmland is lying fallow. The animals are dying. They're losing 20, 30% of their livestock, not because the Russians are killing them, but because they can't feed them. They can't move them. They can't sell them. They can't care for them. So the cascading effects are destroying completely the Ukrainian economy. So Ukraine's output is about non-existent now.
So December 1st is 3 days from now. There's already snow on the ground in the northern parts of Ukraine. Where do you see this going in the next 4, 5, 6 weeks, say between now and the first of the year?
Well, the experts on these matters, and I'm not one of them, that know something about the weather and about the terrain in Ukraine. I've seen some of Ukraine, but not all of it. And the Ukrainian black earth topsoil varies from 4 to 12 to 15 feet deep. It depends on where you are. That's why it's such a productive region. You have to freeze that, because if it's not thoroughly frozen, you sink like a rock, whether you're in a truck or you're in a tank. It doesn't make any difference. It's not frozen yet. It's only just now dropped below freezing on a permanent basis. Up till this point, we've had freezing at night, but during the daytime, it's gone back up into the 40s or even 50 degrees. It has to drop below freezing and stay that way for at least 2 weeks. So if it's now below freezing and it stays that way, you can do the math. You're looking for something happening no earlier than the 10th, probably no later than the 19th of December. And you're talking about concentrations of Russian troops all the way around the country. We've accounted now formally by these are the people that sit in front of your monitors that control satellites. And the intelligence community says that it's accounted for 540,000 Russian troops. Okay. And of that 540,000, we're talking about 5,000 armored fighting vehicles, of which at least 1,500 are tanks, probably another 1,000 self-propelled artillery, the rest infantry fighting vehicles, 1,000 rockets, missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, your so-called drones, unmanned attack systems, 1,000 of those systems. That doesn't even begin to address the hundreds of fixed-wing aircraft, hundreds of helicopters. The helicopters will move troops, obviously. There will be some ground support, hundreds of fixed-wing aircraft operating as close air support, and also bombers now. We've begun to see the use of bombers, which is something we've done for years. They're now beginning to do it, and they all have precision munitions.
Okay, so
which you aim at.
What you've just described must be understood and known by President Zelensky, by Ukrainian intelligence, by American intelligence, by the State Department, by the Pentagon, and by the White House.
Yes.
And what are they going to do about it?
Well, what they're trying to do is they're trying to ship more equipment to the Ukrainians. The problem is the Ukrainian casualties have been horrendous, particularly over the last few months. There was an article today in the Euro News. I'm told there's another one in the New York Times describing the very, very heavy casualties. Of course, the big lie that is always told to accompany the bad news is, well, the Russians have taken heavy casualties too. Nonsense. The Russians have not. And that's the difference. When you're killing your enemy at a 10-to-1 ratio, which is about where it is right now in southern Ukraine with the Russians and Ukrainians, you're not hurting at all. And the Russians, again, aren't running out of anything. The Ukrainians are running out of everything. Ammunition, spare parts, fuel, you name it. Their soldiers, most of the best troops are dead or wounded. And the people that they're shoving forward in the defensive positions are untrained, reservists. They say, well, we sent 10,000 more troops to England for 3 weeks. Judge, you're not going to be able to train a man in 3 weeks to do much of anything, or even 5 weeks. You need time. And time is something the Ukrainians no longer have. So the
Right,
whole,
you are back.
the whole thing is on the verge of collapse.
Let's pretend you are back in the Pentagon as you were for a portion of the Trump administration. And Secretary Austin, along with Secretary Blinken, knock on your door. Colonel, what's your advice? What would you tell them? Get the hell out?
I would show them the map and show them the identified concentrations of Russian forces, along with a list of the capabilities, which are impressive in terms of firepower and maneuver. And I would also then bring up a truthful picture of Ukrainian fighting capabilities right now, which are very, very modest. And I would argue, given the terrible conditions that the population faces in Ukraine, it's no surprise that the Ukrainian government is saying leave. Even Klitschko, who is the mayor of Kyiv, has told the population, you really should leave. We're not going to have any power. We won't have water and fuel to heat. You're going to have to go somewhere else and seek shelter. This is the capital city. And millions of these Ukrainians are going to pack it in and they're going to head west. So you're going to have another gigantic mass casualty event, if you will, on Europe's doorstep, with millions of refugees pouring into Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania.